what we did say from day one was, and in a more philosophical sense, we said, okay, let's work as if nature is the boss. That was kind of where we started.
We have, I think, under the surface had this question of, well, what would nature say? What does nature look like? How would nature direct this? And so that naturally, it's 5 years later turns into actually genuinely giving nature a voice and a vote. And it was really important to us that it made that shift from being philosophical to being real, tapping into the legal governance of a company, changing our purpose statement as a business, which I think we're the only company to have done.
We are on an adventure to unite the stories and solutions of the pioneers, creating a better future for all. Together, we will journey to every continent, every country and community, and ask the question, what is the future you dream of? We will explore the blockers to us getting there, and we will ask, what will it take? What do we need? What do you need to create a future where we all thrive in balance and harmony with nature and each other?
Oh, wow. In this episode, we welcome Simeon and Anne from Dream Quickly. What a dream team! I had so much fun with these two beautiful humans exploring how they co-created a project to put nature on the board at Faith in Nature, and then created a toolkit so you can do the same. We talk about the process and steps that they went through, some of the challenges that they encountered, and how they overcame them. My intention for this podcast is that it's practical and actionable. During the recording, we had a pause of 1 week due to hiding of a router in a rubbish bag. I'm so grateful for the builders who did that. It gave me a moment to pause and reflect and arrive at the consideration that as a community, we need to embody the world we create. So I am super excited to share that we will work with Simeon and Anne to bring nature into the board at Future Planet and share the process with you. We hope that this inspires you to do the same. To find out more about the Nature on the Board toolkit, read the action takeaways from this episode, comment, co-create future episodes, connect with fellow changemakers, and join us on the journey, you can visit futureplanet.love to sign in or sign up. Let's get into it. What are your spirit animals? I'm curious now.
I have actually asked this before and been told that mine's gorilla.
Really?
Do you feel gorilla?
I can sort of get it. On a good day, I get it.
I think I would relate to like wren or something like a bird.
Yeah. I love how you've gone British as well. Like normally the instinct is like to choose a dolphin or something that just doesn't live in this country. But you went classic British countryside, like I'm a wren.
Well, Australia also has wrens. Australian wrens are really cool. They've got like blue bits on them and they're called fairy wrens. So like that's
very beautiful.
They're
So just to clarify, you identify as an Australian fairy wren.
Maybe. I also really like British wrens though.
Yeah.
But I think,
they're a bit more understated.
I feel like too many people have got bad dolphin tattoos to identify as a dolphin.
Yeah. That feels true. I'm going to remove that from our minds.
Yeah, let's do spirit animals.
Yeah, no, spirits. So first we should say, lovely to welcome everyone to the podcast. And we're talking to Simeon and Anne from Faith is Nature. And we thought we'd start with what our spirit animals are, which feels like a really nice start, actually. I was drawn to what you've done because you have, through your creative work, your creative endeavors, you have created nature to be on the board. I think that's the right way to say it. Please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. For Faith in Nature, which is a brand. And so today I'd love to explore that story with you. I'd love to explore your journey. You were talking about feeling around being in nature. You were sharing about like spending time in nature. And so it feels only right and fitting that your purposeful work is putting nature into the heart of an organization. And then, so welcome. Nice to meet you both.
You too, and thanks for having us. Yeah, interesting way to start the conversation with spirit animals, but I agree with you. It feels appropriate.
It does, yeah. What was your journey that arose? So who are you? Like, for the people that don't know you, who are you? What's your journey? You're a creative team. You're husband and wife, I think, or yeah. So, like, who are you?
It's good to clear that one up early because I think some people like hold off for a while. They go, are they? Aren't they? Yeah. we're a creative team, a creative director team. We've worked together for a long time. We are married. We are Simeon Rose and Anne Hopkins, and we're creative directors at Faith in Nature.
Nice. And you have a dog as well, I think.
And we have a dog called Sonic, who's right here as well.
And you're in Wales right now?
And we live in West Wales in North Pembrokeshire. But, you know, for many years before that, we were living in London. Before that, I was in Australia. And, you know, I think both of us grew up in nature and with the love of nature. I grew up in the Australian bush.
And I grew up in South Wales in the valleys. And yeah, I think absolutely surrounded by, it felt very normal and natural to, you know, be surrounded by mountains, to be surrounded by the natural world. Where Anne is from, by the way, is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my life. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, it is very beautiful. But I think nature. I'm from quite a remote place called the Barrington Tops in Australia. It's in New South Wales, but I think, you know, nature has always been an inspiration, and also I guess, you know, if you grow up surrounded by nature, particularly somewhere relatively remote, then I guess your creativity is developed because you don't have a lot else to do. And I think, you know, perhaps fairly laterally, I going from that quite remote place in nature ended up in advertising in London. So despite perhaps growing up even without a TV or any form of advertising, ended up in ad agencies in London as a creative there. And I think you have sort of similar stories of coming into this world of advertising from it was quite unexpected for both of us, but it is like a way to channel creativity. And I think, you know, having spent years there, we then turned that to faith in nature.
Yeah, I was drawn to it for whatever reason. Seems sort of inevitable looking back, but I was drawn to advertising from a very young age. I think, much to maybe my folks' horror. I don't know if that's true or not. You know, it wasn't on the cards, I don't think, but for whatever reason, I knew from a young age that's what I wanted to go off and do. And I think it's important to say that because, you know, neither of us are from sustainability backgrounds per se. And, you know, there's so much talk these days about, you know, valid careers and paths that are, you know, that are suitable for today's world. But at the same time, there are so many of us already in careers and roles that are perhaps not always seen as that beneficial to the planet we live on. But they teach us skill sets. You know, we've all got skill sets that we can use and that we've developed and that are unique to whatever we've trained in. And I think the creative process has massively helped us in you know, the creative process that we learned in ad agencies has massively helped us in doing what we've done more recently.
Yeah. And so actually, I think that leads quite nicely into, you know, when we found ourselves in the boardroom at Faith in Nature, on the board at Faith in Nature, you know, I think it was kind of like we'd come from this very different world. And we found ourselves in this boardroom, and we kind of were like, right, we're being asked to make decisions on all sorts of topics, you know, and really found ourselves grappling with what the right thing to do was. And it was just that sort of, I think actually that's where coming, like a sort of not coming directly from the corporate business world into the boardroom was really beneficial and really no doubt led us to the idea of nature on the board really rapidly, because we're sitting in the boardroom going, well, we've got to make the right decision. This company is called Faith in Nature. You know, the name means absolute trust and confidence in nature. You know, that's what faith translates as. And so we've got to get it right. And yet, you know, in this room, everyone's represented, but everything, you know, the one voice not represented here is the voice of nature, and yet everything we're doing impacts nature. And, you know, as a company that's so deeply cared about nature for almost 50 years, you know, it's really important to get it right. And so, you know, that question was turning around in our head of how do we make the right decision? And that's And that's when we started to wonder, well, our initial question was, can nature be the boss of the company? Which was, kind of a wild question, but it's like full credit to Faith in Nature that they were just like, oh yeah, let's explore that. Like, it's like, that's interesting. Let's explore it. And so we did.
Yeah.
I'm turning to you to pick up here.
Sure. Okay. So yeah.
I mean, you can pick up directly, or we can explore different parts about that.
Sure.
I can sit here and you can go. That's fun.
All right. Well, look, I can explain. I can tell the story. Stop me if any bits are unclear or whatever. But I suppose what Anne said is so true. We found ourselves in a boardroom being asked to make these, big decisions in an environment that we never necessarily intended to enter. The boardroom. Not coming from that sort of commercial background, not coming from a sustainability background either, and yet really wanting to make sure that what we were doing at Faith in Nature and for Faith in Nature was really doing as much as possible to protect the natural world and to have as minimal an impact upon it as possible too. And so I think, honestly, there was probably just a feeling of being slightly out of our comfort zone, out of our depth. If you're getting asked to make a decision on one thing versus another, and what really matters to you and what you feel should really be taken into account is which of those decisions has the least impact upon the natural world, whilst also recognizing that all decisions ultimately have an impact upon the natural world. And then I think that's a really interesting, it was a really interesting springboard for asking much more interesting questions, because it was at that point that we realized whilst all decisions we're making were impacting upon nature, there was one voice not present in that decision-making process, and that was nature's voice. So it was really trying to get to the nub of how you can sort of rebalance that, how you could bring nature's voice into the boardroom, what we could do to redress that balance between business world and the natural world. And as Anne said, our initial question was, and it is lateral and it is perhaps quite a jump, but to say, well, what if nature was really the boss of this company? What would nature choose? What would nature say? That's a question we come back to a lot. What would nature say? And in the background, as we were sort of asking ourselves these questions, and, we go on walks daily and, we live together, we create together, we work together all the time. So we're sort of bouncing this back and forth between ourselves and, talking to friends about it, becoming increasingly interested at the time and still obviously in the idea of environmental personhood and granting rights to nature and the rights of nature movement. And I think getting to that point of going, well, if it's possible to make nature a legal person that can speak in its own best interest, why isn't it also possible to have nature as a legal person within a company speaking in its own best interest, especially a company trying to do its best for nature? And that was the thought process.
There's so much that arrives. The elements that really arrive for me, there's an authenticity that I think is often missing, and I love that faith, I love your articulation of faith in nature, because it's easy just to let that wash through you, but to then just really tune faith in nature is so strong. And I love the permission they gave you to go so much further in terms of how that was lived out. Because we've seen over the last year or year and a half, the challenges of that not being delivered or not lived out, or, and then people feeling afraid to share something, or perhaps companies being pulled up for what they're doing. So there's something like, I love the authenticity and integrity around that. And the asking better questions really arrives for me as like such a good thing as well. Like I've such a big thing. What questions are we asking? Are we asking better questions? And what would nature do? Is just like, that's like a key,
Yeah. Like I think actually that came from our background as creatives in advertising, right? Because actually that whole job is about coming in and asking questions, being really curious, and having empathy, you know, putting yourself in other people's shoes and saying, well, what do they think about this? What do they feel about this? What matters? And I think that's quite at odds with the way that business people have been taught to behave, where it's like, actually, there's, in business culture, it seems like there's like, you've got to have the answers. You can't be seen not to have the answer, not be able to answer everything. Whereas actually, I think the power is in asking the question, and because that's the only way we're going to get to different ways of doing things. If we accept that, you know, we don't just have the answers, and that we can try to ask different questions and do things differently. And I think, you know, that question of how might business change if nature had a voice and a vote, you know, is huge. What would nature say is another question that, you know, we now at Faith in Nature, that's now written on every on the office wall, on the boardroom wall, on the factory wall. It's like, you know, that question in itself is so powerful. And I think we'll talk more about what we've done with nature on the board and on a governance level, and on a you know, it's obviously being the world's first company to put nature on the board is huge, and that's like a huge structural change. But I think on a cultural level, the question of what would nature say is really, really important as well, because, you know, I think what we really love about that question is that whether you're 5 years old, or whether you're 95 years old, or you know, whether you're working on a factory floor or a CEO somewhere, if you ask yourself that question, you're just tapping into a different way of thinking, and you're kind of giving yourself, I guess, permission to take nature into account. And I think also when you ask yourself that question, most of the time, you know the answer. You know, like, we know, like, we have within our better nature, like if you tap into your better nature, you know right from wrong. You know what the right thing to do is. And I think that that's really interesting as well. Like, we don't always, not every single thing takes an expert. You know, if you tap into your better nature, you know often.
That feels true. I feel and so what arises to me there is connection. Like, how connected are we to ourselves and to the world around us, or how disconnected are we? And what have we substituted nature connection for as well? There's a number of challenges that I see there around, because I think when I think about what you've done with Faith in Nature, it wasn't an open door, but the culture was there. There was a willingness and an openness to receive the right questions. And I see often, and so what I'd love to explore with you, and I'm going to share what I'd love to explore, then I'm going to share a little bit, and then we can go into it, is what are the circumstances? So you've got culture, you've got process, you've got the things that are more complicated in a business that you've got to fit with to make it change. And then you've got that sort of ongoing, how do you make it live in reality? Like, how do you make sure that that's lived out through, you know, future actions? And how do you make sure that other people in a supply chain or in everything that the business touches also, or customers also, are able to go on that journey as well in an authentic way? So I'd love to explore those. But if I was to think about some of the people that may be listening to this, they're coming from a range of different backgrounds, right? And in some organizations, they may not feel like they have permission to even ask the question. It feels like even at the beginning, you need a sense of a culture which is safe to share, a culture which is safe to ask these kinds of questions. And I think even if I think about agency brand relationships, like, that's a luxury that you created there to be able to like arrive in and say, hey, what about this? Because there often can be, and not always, and it's changing definitely, but there can be some challenge there. Like, a lot of the blockers we come up against are pure commercial, pure materiality challenges. And there is a change. I'm definitely seeing that. So how do you feel like, if we looked at the culture piece first, like, what are the components of a culture that enables us to ask good questions? Like, what did you find at Faith in Nature that enabled that? What were the people there that helped that to happen? Did you build allies initially? Like, how was that process for you?
Sure. So I think actually on that, feeling comfortable asking what some might see as stupid questions, I think that in itself is something worth talking about, because, and this is again where I'm very grateful actually that we spent so long in ad agencies, because a large part of the creative process in creative agencies is churning out so many ideas, and 99% of them get rejected. So you get very comfortable with rejection actually. And it's not a comfortable process, but you do get comfortable with being told your ideas are rubbish, right? So like you go through this, and there comes a point where you actually know when you're onto something good, but equally, it's not always received that way, and you have to just be okay with that as well. So our creative process that we've spent years going through, we've put tons of stuff out there that I think we feel could have been great. Nothing I don't think as important as this, but I think that was the start point that is really worth looking at here. Is developing that culture of trying things out, of openness to different ideas, of not shutting stuff down, and actually being, but also on the other side of that, being very willing to put it out there and have someone critique it and criticize it and say, you know what, for whatever reason, that's not right.
And a culture of accepting craziness, in a way of or crazy ideas. And I think at Faith in Nature, that was there from the beginning. Like Rivka started the company in 1974, and when she made her 100% natural soap and said, I'm going to sell this for, like a fraction of what, when she went to all of the shops and they were like, you need to sell this for a lot more. And she's like, no, I want this natural, good for you product to actually be something that everyone can have, not just and something that's very exclusive. And so when she did that, everyone said she was crazy. And I think that's just it, isn't it? It's like, and now it's normal. And I think it's things that at some point in time might seem out there. Eventually, if they are real, and if they are tapped into the way the world is heading, or they become normal. And so access to natural products became normal over the past, the 50 years since. And I think, we're hoping that nature being represented within companies becomes normal and not such a sort of novel idea. Hopefully it doesn't take 50 years, but already we know that a number of other companies are going to be doing it or announcing that they've done it very shortly.
But you've got to be willing also to just trust that like the right idea will land. When it's meant to, that you put out ideas for all these years, that, or rather you trust, I think, that the right idea will land where it's meant to, when it's meant to. Because even at Faith in Nature, we started working closely with the company in 2017. We certainly didn't go in from day one and say, I think what we should do here is try to make nature the boss of the company. What we did say from day one was, and in a more philosophical sense, we said, okay, let's work as if nature is the boss. Mm. That was kind of where we started. And the first thing we started to do was we started to look at the aesthetics of stuff, the superficial stuff, the labels, the packaging. And we said, okay, so if nature was the boss, what would this company look like?
And if nature was the creative director, that was the thing. I think when we came in, there was a lot, like the whole natural looked minimalist, and it was all this sort of very clean, Scandi, minimalist look. And we came in and we said, well, if nature is your creative director, designers, then let's look at what lessons we can take from that. And you actually look into the natural world, and it's not minimalist.
It's chaos.
It's wonderfully chaotic, and there's a lot of color, and there's a lot of there are layers, and that became a starting point. And I think that was a catalyst that then has just stayed with us. But anything we're doing, we we have, I think, under the surface had this question of, well, what would nature say? What does nature look like? How would nature direct this? And so that naturally,
It's
5 years later turns into actually genuinely giving nature a voice and a vote. And it was really important to us that it made that shift from being philosophical to being real, because I think that's another, you sort of talk about pushbacks. There's another thing that's out there. It's like, well, we can say that, we can have internal philosophies that are nature first or this or that. But I think actually making something a reality, tapping into the legal governance of a company, changing our purpose statement as a business, which I think we're the only company to have done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes. I think there's so much in that to unpack as well. That process of refinement, right? So you continue. If you really feel that it's a question worth asking, you keep asking it, and you get deeper and deeper and deeper, right? You go to deeper and deeper levels with it. So you start superficially and say, what would nature say if it was, designing our labels? Or what would nature say if it was our creative director? And then you get deeper and you sort of go, okay, so what would nature say about what partnerships we choose? What would nature say about, how we source things? What would nature say about packaging, about this, about that? And eventually that process of refinement and getting deeper and deeper and deeper, it got super structural. And at that point we went, okay, just what would nature say full stop? What would nature say if nature was actually, in charge of this company? How can we figure that out? And I think that's the other part of the creative
the point
process.
where we got out of our depth and had to bring in experts as well.
Absolutely. But that is also, there's a parallel there with the creative process that you learn in ad agencies, which is, as a conceptual creative, you go through the creative process, you get to the thing you think is really great, you get buy-in, and then you approach a production company. And normally what that means is, you start working with film directors, and what popped out at the end is a film or a photo shoot or whatever. But in this case, you go, okay, we're getting something structural here. Who's our production company? And the production company were environmental law organizations. They were the ones who were going to actually execute. Like, the within advertising this and creative industries, so much is in the execution. The idea is really important, but so much is in the execution. It's exactly the same with this.
And the effective execution as well. Like, I think that's I see it happening with CSR reports. I see it happening with a lot of different elements of stuff that's being done in the name of being good or better. And I'm not saying that that's bad to do those things, but often it's about embedding it into the organization, embedding it into decision making, embedding it into what happens in the factory, embedding it in decisions that happen on the farm, embedding it into those buying decisions. All of it's there. I think that's where the proof is. Otherwise, it's just like, it sounds good, and some people are into it, but not everyone knows about it, and not everyone's doing it. And I think that I'm curious to explore the law element as a production part, because the organizations I've seen have some of the most effect have been, for example, like Client Earth, where they've used the law, used that existing structure to implement change in an effective way, because once you can get it into the structure, you can then, it's there. People have to follow it. The same as if you have KPIs, for example, or something like that. And so what was that part of that process? Like, how did you support that team, and could you shine a light on that part of the process?
Yeah, so it was super important to us that, and I think there's also, being completely open, we're also very aware that, coming from the background we come from, that if we did this incorrectly, it could be perceived as not being real enough, not actually delivering on what we actually wanted it to deliver on. So it was super important to us that we found the right partners.
Or could have been taken on by others in a greenwashy way. I think there were lots of concerns about it.
Yeah, so we were very aware of what the kickback might be, which also led us then to really want to make sure we worked with, as you mentioned Client Earth, work with environmental lawyers who advocate for the natural world day in, day out, who would not lend their name to this if it wasn't real and if it wasn't structural. So we looked, we did what I guess you do at any sort of research stage. You start looking at the stories out there that inspire you, that feel the biggest. And, I guess the most famous example of environmental personhood is always the River Wanganui in New Zealand. We looked into the organization that done that. That was Earth Law Center in Colorado.
Hang on, you've gone through that super quickly. So what was that project in New Zealand?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, no, don't apologize. Fine.
Right. So we were in that process of looking for environmental law organizations who could really make this meaningful and real. We looked for the stories out there that were most famous, that seemed the most radical, and that seemed most inspiring. And the one that, for whatever reason, seems the most famous is the River Wanganui, which is a river in New Zealand, being granted environmental personhood. And effectively what that means is that river has rights. That river is a legal person. That river can really act in its own best interests, or rather within the legal structure that had to be created around it.
The law can be used to uphold. Yeah.
Yeah, that guardians can do that. So, for example, if that river was polluted, that river would have the right to sue whoever had polluted it. That sort of thinking.
And then it has guardians, so that has people that assume the right of a human guardian, for example, that can, like, how many? I'm curious. Like,
exactly. So the way that this was later explained to us was, if you imagine the relationship between a child having to go to court for whatever reason, and the person who actually represents that child, the child themselves cannot represent themselves in a court of law, but a guardian, a responsible adult, can speak on their behalf. And I think that's really poignant, actually, when you think of the natural world in that sense, because it shines a light on how vulnerable the natural world is, right? The natural world needs guardians to speak on its behalf. And yet, at the same time, the natural world speaks really loudly every single day. We just ignore it, right? Like, it's not speaking in a human language. It's causing, you only need to pick up the newspaper to see the damage it's causing around the world, and, to see the agony that the natural world is clearly in. It speaks really loudly, but for whatever reason, for it to be brought into human systems, the law needs to work, and human law effectively has to be reimagined to work on behalf of the natural world. And that way we start finally listening to what the natural world is telling us. So they're the sort of stories out there that were inspiring us. And we just wrote to who we saw as the best organizations. We wrote to Earth Law Centre in America and Lawyers for Nature in the UK. And
they actually answered the calls and the emails, which was incredible, really. I think they were, they themselves say that they were shocked to be getting a call from a company. They're used to protecting trees and rivers and the elements of the natural world, and they're usually connected to that. They're sort of talking to governments and things like that, but they hadn't expected a company to call them up and ask them to apply the rights of nature to the way that their company structure works. And so then that conversation,
interesting conversations,
conversation started, and for the next sort of year and a half after that, we all worked together to try and work out how we could bring the rights of nature inside business, which was an incredible journey to go on. Yeah, it was amazing. It just felt super exciting and super just, everything, like all the creative processes that we'd learned and all the stuff out there that we were being inspired by, it just felt like it was all like coming together, like tributaries in a river. It was just an amazing thing to be part of. Finally, obviously, the story coming out, not just the story coming out, the actual move being implemented, actually, that was the bit that was just like mind-blowing. And that was so incredible, actually, to the bit of the first board meeting, where the first board meeting with nature, just was incredible. And I think we all realized how important it was, and what an incredible shift, and what incredible potential this had to change the way that business was done. And it was amazing.
I can feel the energy of that moment. Like, that would have been extraordinary. Like,
Yeah.
did you feel a sense of, sorry, what did you say? Go.
No, I was going to say we have a Zoom recording of it somewhere or other. It was that moment of just going, gosh, this is this is a line in the sand. It is, it's groundbreaking. And I think everybody just felt, I mean, it was the first, from the moment that the paperwork was all signed and legal, they were the first moments of a sort of a new business landscape. And yeah, the energy of it was incredible. And and it
what
continues.
Was your spiritual journey like on that? Well, like, what was your, like, so I'm going to share a little bit about mine, but I'm curious, right? So I've been more and more noticing and feeling people arriving around me, and this sort of sense of different people being called in service of nature, and it not just being a theoretical thing or, oh, I work in this industry, it being a kind of very visceral, very emotive feeling. And I'm wondering if because you manifested this incredible key, right? Like, you've created this thing that can be pollinated to other organizations and other businesses, and it's come from nature. And in that process, did you have a sense of being called, or like, what was happening for you personally?
We can talk about that. Well, I'll speak personally so that I know what I'm saying on this. I definitely had this sense, not only within the boardroom, of being asked questions that I wasn't qualified to answer, and feeling that there was a voice out there that deserved to be heard. Not only that, but also feeling that if I was going to be in that role, I had to feel completely comfortable with myself. Like, if I was going to make these calls, I wanted to know that I was genuinely making calls in the interest of the natural world. Otherwise, I didn't feel comfortable being there. I don't want to be in a business that's perpetuating business as normal, or continuing with the problem that had that been what was on the table, I'd have walked away. That's not what I wanted from it. So I think there are a few things there. One is wanting to feel truly comfortable in myself, and basically able to live with myself, as obviously you try to grow a business, growing it therefore in a responsible way. Like that's the one side of it. And then the other side of it is actually just recognizing where you are in a moment, and going, for whatever reason, and whatever forces have sort of moved to land me at this point right here, I'm in a position where I can do something really great here. We've got the trust of these people. We've got this idea. We've got a company that's willing. It's not quite pushing on an open door, but in many ways it was. And it's actually going, right, this is a moment where we can do something. And I think that sort of gets to, if I was to describe that, from a spiritual journey sense, that's as close as I get to, an understanding of what that might mean.
Yeah. By spiritual, I feel for me, it's about being connected to nature. Like, religion is not my thing, really. It's more about, like, it's feeling that connection, feeling that sense of knowingness, of that sort of sense of being in flow, that the things are arriving around us. And did you have what was your, like?
Yeah, I know. I think that Simeon has always really puts it more eloquently than I will. But I think, for me, there was almost a sense of, actually, how do I say this? It's like the empathy of seeing that nature has, recognizing that nature has rights and things like that, just actually felt so natural to me of going, well, I think having grown, sorry, I'm going to start that bit again, but I guess having grown up somewhere wild and remote where, you know, really my best friends were animals and things like that. There's that, you know, I've come from a place where it's only natural that, of course, those animals' feelings should be taken into account, and where you really notice and have a connection to the natural world around you. And so actually it's kind of like, well, you know, it's almost like that wasn't such a kind of crazy mind flip for me, but to actually to be able to share that and make it accessible and normal within the parallel universe, which is otherwise business, I think, where business is quite separate, and where it's like you know, there's this sort of teaching to not go into it with empathy, but to go into it with kind of rationality. I think to be able to bring that empathy in, and that mindset where it's like we do take nature into account, and we do connect ourselves to nature and think, what matters to nature? How does how would nature feel about this? How does this impact nature? And to bring that into the conversation and the decision-making process at the beginning. I think that's really a really important point of this as well. You know, essentially what nature on the board is doing is saying, let's ask permission at the beginning rather than asking forgiveness at the end. You know, like, and I think that business
or not thinking about it.
Yeah, business has kind of not thought about it till the end bit. Then it's kind of like, oh, we've done all this stuff. Now we have to
put it right,
offset it, or ask forgiveness for it, or put it right. And I guess what we're trying to do.
It's not brought into the heart of the. It's not brought into the heart of the. It's sort of seen as a. You're right. It's a thing externally, or a thing there, or yeah. And so you've created a. Oh, sorry, go.
No, I think it's actually just creating and embedding that culture where you say, right, we're going to actually think in a different way, and we're going to think in a way that takes nature into account and has that conversation about how this is impacting nature right from the beginning. And we're going to have it from the factory floor to the boardroom, rather than just sort of saying that bit is compartmentalized within a sustainability department or within a sustainability role. It needs to be cultural, and that is a mindset shift, not a department.
Are you working to take action on climate, nature, social and sustainability goals? Then you can apply to join our community of action at futureplanet.love. Through an intentional community of your peers and subject matter experts, online and live events, and a knowledge-sharing platform, the Future Planet Community of Action empowers you to share energy and expertise, receive support, find solutions, gain the confidence to make decisions, and collaborate to have a greater impact. To discover more and apply to join, visit futureplanet.love. Right, let's get into it. Arriving back with big energy, you'll notice that maybe, actually, you two have exactly the same dress, but we had a little pause because of a technical hitch. I've got different headphones, probably have my hair up. I think I've managed to remove the mirror. You both are looking glorious and fabulous. Calling in from the hills in Wales. Nice to see you, Simeon and Anne, today. For the second part of our podcast about putting nature on the board, which is fantastic work you did with Faith in Nature. And we're really going to get into the detail today, right? Like the how did you do it? So if someone wants to understand how do they do it, how would they do the same? The intention of this part of the call is to really give you that kind of insight into how you did it, what some of the challenges were, what some of the processes you went through, and how someone might learn from that and implement that themselves. Because you've got a toolkit as well, which is on Faith in Nature's website, and you've really thought about how this was not just a project for one organization. You've really thought about how to pollinate that to many other organizations as well. So I'm really excited to bring that to everyone today. How does that sound?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Sounds
I like
great.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. how did you get the project to work? Who did you connect with? Like, what were those first steps? Like, it was an idea. Was it a brief that was given to you? Like, what was that process? And then what were the next steps after that?
The brief, if you want to call it that, came from Anne. As in, we were basically, we'd been spending years getting to this point of going, what does it mean to be a greener company? A responsible company in today's world. And this is just a thought process that we were going round and round and round with, and deeper and deeper and deeper, until it got to this point of Anne actually just asking, well, could nature really be the boss? We were aware of this idea of environmental personhood, but not in any great way. And so we just started researching and got in touch with the people that we'd read about doing really interesting stuff out there, like granting rights to the River Wanganui. That was Earth Law Centre in the US, and obviously needing a UK counterpart because we're operating in UK corporate law. So we called up Lawyers for Nature as well, and a huge amount of this work was done by them, done by Bronte Ansell, Lawyers for Nature, creating a legal framework that actually recognises nature as a legal stakeholder in corporate governance.
You did that work on your own before approaching Faith and Nature, or you'd asked Faith, or Faith and Nature knew they wanted to go in that direction?
We were doing it with Faith and Nature, for Faith and Nature. With them. So
and I think we'd sort of talked about some of the other thinking that we'd had with Faith in Nature, where we'd almost used this question or this thought process of nature being the boss and that kind of thing as almost a creative filter for everything we'd been doing with them. And then it was sort of pushing it further. And I think this came out of a moment where we'd been working with Faith in Nature for a number of years, and eventually, they put us on the board, and we found ourselves in board meetings, being faced with quite complex decisions to make. Everyone on the board really wanted to do the right thing by nature and by the natural world and make the right decisions. But we'd all, we'd be in this room with people spending literally hours and hours and hours trying to work out what the right thing to do was. And I think, coming in as outsiders really to this business world, because we'd come from a creative background, it felt like a lot of weight to how do you make the right decision. And it dawned on us quite quickly that, while all of these decisions had a huge impact on the natural world, the only voice that wasn't in the room was that of nature. And so that's when we started toying with these questions of how do you bring nature in, and how do you get that information in a way that's not just sort of the company ticking a box, really, of going oh yes, we've considered that. It's how do you actually get that independent voice of nature on your board? And so that's really what led us to to asking the question, could nature actually be a boss of a company, to actually digging into this rights of nature. I think once we started reading about the rights of nature and the really interesting stuff that was happening around the world, where nature was being given rights to defend itself from companies who polluted it. So the River Wanganui in New Zealand being given legal personhood rights to protect itself, and other cases happening around the world. That's when we thought, this is happening. This kind of thing is happening. Can we connect the dots and do that within business? Because so far I can't see it happening anywhere. But maybe that's possible. So we called those people up.
Yeah, before that, Anne does have a knack of being able to just get right to the heart of something. So when we were, I think, just walking our dog or something or other, and when she just said, "So do you think nature could really be the boss of the company?" I was like, "That's it. That's just the most brilliant and beautiful question." And yeah, we asked, we obviously spoke to everyone at Faith in Nature, look, we'd really like to look into this, and it was brilliant. It was just this.
Everyone was like, yes, do that. That's amazing. This is.
We don't know what it is, but figure it out.
But that is a very cool thing about Faith in Nature. They are actually, I think, as they've got that maverick spirit as a company that, they started because of because of their passion for nature and like making natural products and all that kind of thing in the 70s, they haven't come out of this sort of cynical, I see a gap in the market. They've actually come out of true passion. And so I think that maverick spirit of like, yeah, I'm not sure what it is you're talking about, but you should totally go and do that, was there from the beginning. So we were very lucky with that.
That's so interesting. And so when you talked about it, when you talked about nature having a place or a seat on the board, what that allowed you to do is then bring in people that represented various viewpoints or expertise from the natural world, or who had expertise. So it gave you that permission to bring someone into the space where people could ask questions and figure out what their strategy was. I have two things that I want to explore with you. One is, how did that then translate through the organization into actual action? And I think specifically when I think about it, often there are layers in an organization, and you might have the senior part of the organization very engaged, but actually there may be some trouble with middle of an organization, or you might have the middle really engaged, but there's trouble engaging senior people. And then you've got people that are on the ground that might be engaged, but this is various layers where often there is a challenge to getting good ideas to flow through to action through everyone, so everyone's unified. That's the first thing I'd love to explore. And then the second is, you were very lucky. You had a maverick organization that was up for this, right? But I think a lot of people might just have a small constellation of champions, and that's where they're starting. So let's explore first. And so how would they look to overcome that? And how would they look to do it when maybe their environment is not quite so fertile? Not without green shoots, but not quite so fertile. So initially, like, how did that nature on the board progress through to the actions that Faith in Nature was making? And do you have perhaps some examples of that?
Yeah, so I think part of that is understanding that Nature on the board has come on as a director. And I'll rewind a little bit, but come on as a director as opposed to coming on as the CEO or the boss, which was Anne's first imagining of this. And that is actually quite fundamental, because you're talking about layers within an organization. You're talking about really just encouraging a conversation as opposed to being some sort of nature-based dictator. That's not what we're trying to achieve here, right? So when we first started speaking to the environmental lawyers involved, Earth Law Centre and Lawyers for Nature certainly came back and were like, within UK jurisdiction, you can't actually legally be, we can't make nature the CEO, but we can make nature a director. And what that does is it makes it infinitely more replicable, right? Because you're bringing in a voice, you're bringing in an entity with a vote, but you're not necessarily you're not putting them at the top of the pile. And that's really important for a number of different reasons. One is obviously that even if we were able to do that, which we're not, how many other companies would realistically do that? Actually just bringing in that voice, bringing in that expertise and this other viewpoint is in some ways a softer approach, but in other ways is way more powerful, because it's achievable. Any company that wants to can do this. And that was a key part of why we open sourced it. So coming back to your question then of like layers within the company, nature has come in obviously on the board, not necessarily as the pinnacle or the one that decides everything. Nature doesn't have a veto, but that's not really the point. The point is starting the conversation. And answering that, if you think back to the problem that we talked about before that we had when we were on the board, was like, how do we know what the right thing to do is? Do we have all of the information in front of us to help us make the right decisions? And I think what having nature as a director on the board does, it means that we have that voice in the room. We have someone there as a proxy for nature who brings that viewpoint of the natural world, taps into whoever they need to speak to bring some expertise. And that's a really important part of the role as well, that our nature representative is independent of Faith in Nature, and that they have full permission to go and, seek information from their vast sort of network of nature-based experts, I guess. And so having them on the board means that they bring that information and expertise and insight,
and they vote. And I think by bringing that and seeing how they vote, then it really helps everyone else on the board to make better decisions as well. And so that's been hugely helpful. And so we see how that, I mean, frankly, it just speeds things up. It kind of is like we don't now sit there kind of agonizing, going, is that the best right thing to do? Or is that, like what is it? So it's sped things up. But I think the really, really interesting stuff is actually how you then look at this through different layers of the company. And a really interesting thing at Faith in Nature is because this company's been around for 49 years, nearly 50 years, and because we manufacture our products as well, we've got people who work on the factory floor, and they've been like, we've got people who've been cutting soap at Faith in Nature for like 30 years. It's amazing. And so, and you've got to kind of look at it and go, well, how does this thing at board level, how is that going to touch and affect the people on the factory floor or the people in the office or even like people who stock Faith in Nature or use Faith in Nature? How do we take that all the way through?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so sort of running in tandem with that, we also I look at it as an ad campaign, but really it's a question. It's a question that we put everywhere, and it's on the factory walls, it's in the offices, it's on briefs and everything.
And we wrote a song about it.
And Anne wrote a song about it. This question, what would nature say? And I think like that is a really important part.
That's interesting. So let's talk more about that part of the process. Like, how did you get that engagement? How did you get that? Like, because I guess what would be perfect is if everyone embodies nature and feels like they themselves have nature within them, and then their actions are in line with each other in terms of that. And I guess there's something around understanding and deciding what those best actions are. And in this instance, you're saying that you had a board expert come in and help the board to understand it. So you put posters up, you did other things. Like, what was that engagement that you did around it through the organization? And how many people in Faith in Nature were you? Like, what's the size of the organization you were getting to be on board with this?
Faith in Nature is 100 people.
So that includes manufacturing and then the more office-based people. I think so engagement has really come through almost like you've got the two parts of it. I think it's super important to have that legal framework in place to actually say it's a stake in the ground. It says, as a business, we recognize that nature should have rights. Nature is not just a resource we can take from without asking permission or taking into account how our actions impact them. Nature has rights, and those are legal rights. So that's a stake in the ground, and that is nature on the board. It's written into our constitution. We legally have nature as a representative on our board, and they have rights. And then for the rest of the company, because that is, that whole legal framework it's got, we really wanted to say, well, how do we connect that with absolutely everyone through the business? And we said, well, what's the simplest way? What's the simplest distillation of what we've done? And I think it is, asking the question of, hey, what would nature say? And I think almost we realized that actually business has been taught within the business world. It's like you've been taught to kind of always have all the answers and to ask what's right for business, what's right for profit. And it's almost like it's been trained out of people to actually connect with the natural world. And so actually by giving the whole company this question of, hey, what would nature say? Putting it everywhere, writing a song about it, doing this, all of the stuff around that. It's given the whole business permission to ask the question, what would nature say? And so, and I think our other point when we put this out there was we're like, because, if you ask yourself, what would nature say? You probably already know the answer to that. Like for most things, we have a moral compass. We know right from wrong. It's just that we've been trained not to ask that question and not to tap into that. It's like shove that down and just ask what's best for profits. And so we've given the whole company like permission to ask what would nature say? And you now hear it everywhere. It's totally amazing, from the factory floor to the boardroom to, it's like, well, what would nature say about this? And it's really cool. It's like, and that's actually
That's the heartwarming
super transformational
Mm.
because it gives everyone power to go, to take it on.
I love that. And I'm so excited about asking ourselves better questions and giving permission. I think it's such a key. Like, it's such a simple key, isn't it? We don't have, you just need nothing more than like one single question that we need to ask each other. And you're absolutely right. We do that's gold, Anne. That's just gold.
I told you, she's got a real knack for like just
That's
getting
gold.
things.
Yeah, that's really aligned. And it really like I find myself in so many rooms with different people teasing out challenges around organizational engagement or how to transform organizations. And it's always about ask better questions, I find. Like, are we asking ourselves the right question? Are we asking ourselves better questions? And this sort of sense as well of values. And I like this, this sort of, what are we valuing and what are we asking ourselves and how are we then therefore acting? And that it's so almost like you don't need anything else beyond that. However, one challenge that I have been frequently arriving or at is perhaps sometimes a lack of time. And then if an organization has yet to change its KPIs, for example, or what people are being rewarded by, or how their roles are being, I guess, marked, it's probably not the right word, but like, and there's a real challenge for them to find time to ask the right questions. And I love what you're saying about if it's legally embedded, then it sort of means that they have to. But I'm quite curious, like, how would that then, I can see it work for an organization that's 100 or 200, or even perhaps 700-800 or something like that. But how would that work for a larger organization? I'm so curious about that because it feels like a big, like, so how might that work in that sort of environment? Is that an interesting question to explore? I think it probably is. I don't know how it might work there.
Well, I don't think fundamentally the structure, although I'm not the corporate lawyer or the environmental lawyer, I don't think fundamentally the structure has to change. What has to change, obviously, is the willingness to actually implement it, right? So it's a lot easier probably to convince a company of 100 people where everyone is basically aligned than it might be to convince a bigger company with many, many shareholders and many, many more people. But I think that really puts the onus back on us, right? It puts the onus back on us to prove this is successful and meaningful and that it works and that it creates positive change. And not just us, but then, I can't say who, but I know there are other companies coming on board and doing this too. And
nice.
It puts the onus on, yeah, it is. It's the best, right? And it puts the onus on them to prove it too. And like collectively, if more and more companies can start going, you know what, this works. It works for nature, which obviously is the reason we did it. But it also works commercially, and we're still successful. We're thriving, like all the rest of it. You need to prove all that sort of stuff so that it gets to the point where there's no argument against doing this.
I think as well, like, I was having a conversation with some organizations about risk recently. And so those of us that understand nature and water understand the risk of not looking after it, I think, which is quite a lot of us. Probably if you're listening to this podcast, you're definitely going to be one of them. But that not yet being translated into how an organization is responding or working at the moment. So often risk might be perhaps reputational, definitely financial, maybe something around like other elements, like are we able to hire people correctly, and probably is climate seen as a risk, or there might be regulatory risks. But it's still quite new, this looking at the impact of not valuing nature as a risk, or looking at the impact of not valuing water as a risk. And I wonder there if the connection between those two might, like, if it feels like those two sort of go hand in hand. You've got risk, governance, legal structures, and that's an interest. If you're valuing risk higher in a larger organization or any organization, then you have to look for solutions whereby you're valuing, I guess, nature. It looks like you might have something to share on that. You're probably waiting for me to finish.
No, I'm just like, as you're saying it, I'm going, yeah, this connects. Like the flip of that is, yes, recognizing the bigger risk of not taking this stuff seriously. But, the flip of that word risk is kind of success, right? As in, if you're looking at this
reward,
reward, the other end of the telescope, because actually what a director's role is, and this is the bit that Bronte came to me with and was like, you like understand this bit, that a director's sole responsibility at a company is to ensure the success of that company. And it's about redefining what success means. And actually that's the way that nature as a non-human entity is able to serve on the board, because nature can argue that in order for a company to be successful, obviously, I mean, it's not an argument, it is fact, it needs a healthy planet upon which to thrive, right? So by acknowledging, well, you can acknowledge the risk of not doing, and that's one way of looking at it, or actually you look at it the other way around and go, you know what, if this company really wants, well, if all companies want to be successful in the future, we all have to be like rethinking.
Well, you've got to look at both. You've got to look at both. And because the challenge is, if you're currently an organization or a board, and your decision makers in the organization and your remuneration structure or your KPIs are all orientated around what you currently value, then what you currently value, anytime there's a threat to that, that's a risk. And so in the process of transforming an organization, risk is probably probably one of the primary levers with which to get immediate short-term attention. And so one of the challenges is a lack of urgency, or like, even though we know there's an urgency, so we're like fudge, there's an urgency, right? Like I'm practicing not swearing, by the way, anyone that thought that's weird. I'm trying to not swear. I don't know, is fudge a good word to use for that? I don't know. Anyway, if what's being measured today and what's being focused on today is risk, then, and also what often a challenge is companies are quite short term. So they're not able to factor in the longer term, even on climate, like 10 years out, 15, 20 years out is just a lot, it's just pushing it down the road. So these 2040 targets, or even now 2030 or 2050 targets, they're really just a way of saying, we don't want to act quickly enough. It's too difficult to act quickly enough, or, and we don't want to focus on this right now. And nature's not even really coming into the same frame as climate as quickly as climate has. I mean, it is, but not quite. And so the real challenge for us to answer, because we know how important the situation is how to get it right now in like those quarterly decisions for now, or in the 6-month decisions for now, or in this year or next budget, whatever. And then I think risk is a key lever because it's already being looked at. But the way that one would need to also then do is to factor in the risk of the risk within your supply chain, or with the risk within the organizations that you're connected with, of not valuing nature or not valuing water. And then it's a very quick connection to make then between, okay, if we value it as a risk, then let's look at our governance to make sure that we're giving ourselves the reward of being able to do that. It took me a long time to get there, but I think that's an interesting hook for a larger organization to use, because you've got a 1-step, 2-step. Because if you go in just by saying, oh, well, we think it would be a great idea, you're going to get people that think it's a great idea, but they'll have no hold for that like thing to get into. They'll have no organizational hold. I think maybe. Anyway, I've just been riffing, but yeah, hi.
No, I think there are all sorts of interesting ways of getting this into bigger.
Okay, more. Nice. Yeah.
And, so one of them that, a group of people I was looking at and talking to, they've managed to put a model forward of putting nature on the balance sheet as well. So actually it's bringing it into accountancy. So there are more, I think when you just start prodding every single part of an organization going, what's the hook here? Like, where is something sticky? How can we start like actually measuring the true, capital cost in true cost terms, taking the cost to the natural world into account? How is that a functional model? And the answer is yes. That model has been proposed. So there are all sorts of ways, I think, of embedding this and recognizing that risk and finding ways of bringing it in quickly in interesting ways.
But I think this also all taps into asking different questions. I think actually at its very root, what nature on the board is, and what the rights of nature movement even is a mindset flip. And it's that mindset that, like, until once you've had that mindset flip where you're like, whoa, like, nature should have rights. Like, why does that 500-year-old oak tree have zero rights but a company I set up 5 minutes ago have a whole list of rights. Like, why on earth is that? And once you've had that mindset flip that says that's crazy, there's this whole other way of doing things, then you're asking different questions and you're seeing the world differently, and you're going, hang on, if I'm if I'm using nature in some certain way, should I be remunerating nature in some way? Like, should I be asking permission of nature before doing things or taking it into account? And the answer becomes extremely obvious. I just think that the way that the world has been trained to think and do business, actually, once you've had the mindset flip, it looks completely crazy. So actually what we really want to do through this, and I think through communicating it more, is help more and more people have that mindset flip, because once you've done that, then you can take action, right?
That really resonates. Yeah, absolutely. And once people have values aligned, and then they can figure out how to push through whatever their challenges are that they might face and work through them. I noticed, and I love this about, it's one of the things that drew me to you, is the completeness of your thoughts and the completeness of your creativity, because you've created a toolkit as well, haven't you, for people to be able to use in their organizations. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Sure. So when we started this whole process, like I said, we didn't want to be the only ones doing it, because that makes you basically like, an interesting novelty. That wasn't really, we are. I mean, we are very interesting, but it's not what we don't want to remain that, right? So, and the toolkit, by the way, if we'd have just implemented it ourselves, helps us already behave differently and act differently and make better decisions. But that was never really the point of this, or not the sole point. The point was to put something out there that other people can pick up and go, I now don't need to spend 18 months going through the same legal hoops that Faith in Nature have had to do, all the research and all the work that came before launch. I've got this toolkit. I might need to speak to, someone like Lawyers for Nature for a week or so, and they or however long it might take them, but at a significantly shorter amount of time, and I can start implementing it. So we've open sourced everything. We've open sourced the entire legal framework that we've used. That's on Faith in Nature's website. We write about what we've done publicly, on natureontheboard.com. But the framework itself is super interesting. And I think when people look at this and when people look at what we've done, one of the loveliest responses is, that's so simple. I can't believe no one's done it before. Like, that's actually where you go. We're not dealing with something hugely complex. We're just dealing with the fallout of actually approaching this with that mindset flip, going, what is mad in this world is that, people aren't already thinking this way. So nature is represented on our board by currently two, but actually can be any number of legal guardians to nature. So the guardianship model underpins a lot of the rights of nature work. So whatever, the River Wanganui, whatever other aspect of nature is currently being protected within environmental personhood, generally the guardianship model underpins it. And that's kind of the same as saying a child can't represent themselves in the court of law. So that child needs a responsible adult to speak for them. And it's much the same, with nature. Like we humans have created the system within which we all work. If nature wants to have a voice within it, nature needs responsible guardians to protect its interests.
And to stick with the path, yeah.
Yeah, that brings us almost full circle. And it's interesting as we go through these evolutions of innovation and, this sort of a circle arriving where we've had a few centuries of industrial technological innovation, and it's connected us in ways that we've never been able to connect before and grown our world immeasurably. And it's almost now like we're bringing in the thread, which was the thread that we perhaps lost through that mechanization and technology, which is our connection to nature. And then we built these large organizations, and now we're rebuilding how we imagine those organizations. We're rebuilding how we organize ourselves, and having nature within the heart of that feels like such an obvious and necessary and heart-centering element to have. And really appreciate both of you, beautiful humans, for creating this and going through the work and now sharing it with everyone else. It's such a wonderful gift for you to give. We will include this on a blog post, and then we will also share your toolkit in our toolkit as well, and help other people to do the same as you. And whilst we had a pause for this podcast of about a week, whilst we, which was really lovely actually, to reflect on what came next and have some other conversations which added some richness. And one of the reflections that I had was that we would love to put nature on board at Future Planet. And so I'd love to be able to think with you or plan with you how we do that, but then also inspire our community as well to do the same. And it's the same as when we... Yeah! Oh, the dog approves. Awesome. Yes! I love that bark. That's such a good... Like, that's a full-on approval.
Something can join
nature.
this. Here we are.
Thanks, buddy. It's all for you. And we had the same actually when we did an event recently, and we were talking about the words that we used, and how using words that were more aligned with nature, that were more resonant, that were more feeling based, rather than these sort of square, often masculine words that are used that feel different. And so we're also going through the process of moving our words into a different set of words as well. And Michelle Holliday, who has got a book called The Age of Thrivability, which you may know, has got a beautiful way with words. And it talks a lot about organizational... I can't remember which podcast, but I'll tell you at the end. She talks a lot about how you transform organizations in a similar sort of way as well. Anyway, what a pleasure to hang out with both of you again today. I look forward to walking in the hills with you and perhaps bringing a group of other pioneers as well to learn about how to transform their organizations. Thank you both.
Oh, that'd be
We'd love
amazing.
that.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you. Yeah, reach out if you want to do it. All the details there.
Where are the details?
faithinnature.co.uk/a vote for nature.
Yeah, and nature on the board.
natureontheboard.com as well is where I write regularly about my musings about all this sort of stuff.
Nice. Very good. And Dream Quickly is where you're creative.
Dream Quickly is just our creative outpouring, where we probably don't update it very often, but it's that's us.
If we wanted to find you, that's where we'd find you. Nice.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much, you two.
Please like, rate and share this widely on your social channels. The more people that we can welcome to join us on the journey and support the changemakers we champion, the faster we can combat climate change, battle biodiversity loss, and co-create a future we can all love.
Where do we go next? What questions did this spark for you? Would you like to know more about a particular topic? Who shall we adventure to? What shall we ask them? Where shall we go? What shall we build? How shall we do this together? Do you have any questions or comments? Join the Future Planet community of action at futureplanet.love to sign in, sign up, and get involved. Together, we can.